bizarre self-inflicted death of Albert Moon. James Albert Moon, born on 4th July 1838 in Indiana, to Elizabeth Lewis Moon and Rev. Enoch Moon. His father, Enoch Moon, was a minister of the gospel for over a quarter of a century. James was fascinated with machines. From the time James was 15, he and his father had worked upon divers impossible problems, among them being that of perpetual motion. Moon always contended that he could make a machine that would eclipse anything ever invented for taking human life. He went Europe to study the guillotine and improve upon his mechanical engineering. It is believed that he inherited a tendency towards suicidal behavior from his maternal lineage. His mother committed suicide, and so did 2 or 3 other members of her family. Moon himself had twice before attempted to take his own life. Once he crawled into a hayrick and was nearly smothered to death when found. Again, he made the attempt at another hotel in Lafayette with morphine. In 1861, James served in the Civil War to end slavery. He later became a farmer, blacksmith, and self-proclaimed inventor. He lived with his wife, Mary Cox Moon, and 2 children, James Cox and Margaret, in a 2-story but small frame house. The house stood over a cellar on mortared fieldstones, with a cistern in the back, and faced the Locust Grove and High Gap Pike. On Saturday, June 10, 1876, 37-year-old James Albert Moon drove a horse and wagon 9 miles into Lafayette from rural Union Township. It was mellow and warm, strawberry time, and people were already munching lettuce and early peas from farm and home gardens. Moon's horse strained to pull the wagon bearing both the bearded, hatted farmer and his heavy trunk, filled, as it turned out, with the many trappings of an inventor. 5 30-inch lengths of 1x6 lumber, a wooden soapbox, assorted screws, leather straps, a dowel, a brace and 3 bits, a wrench, a screwdriver, a candle, a few yards of lightweight cord, matches, and a pencil. Moon joined scores of other Saturday farmers on a glorious day around the Tippecanoe Courthouse Square in Lafayette. He tied his horse somewhere out of the way, then walked by the busy marketplace on 5th and entered the Lar House, the venerable hostelry on Main Street by the railroad tracks. Their proprietor Otho Weekly and a workforce rented rooms for overnight guests or sites for permanent lodgers, such as merchant businessman John Purdue himself. Moon insisted on a quiet room, maybe something in the rear, abutting the alley if possible. He said he wished to be away from any noise. He could sleep only in a quiet room. When the clerk showed room 41, on the 3rd floor near the south end of the Lar House, overlooking the marketplace, Moon at last nodded. "It suits me first rate." It was 12 by 14 feet with a window opening west looking over 5th Street, a door in the south wall opening into adjoining room 40, another in the east wall opening into the hall. A bed, washstand, and table furnished the room. Moon soon locked the room and walked a block to Isaac L. Beach's hardware store near 4th and Main. There Moon paid cash for a razor-sharp broadex head with a 12-inch blade, had it wrapped, then lugged it 4 blocks down to 2nd and South. He presented the axe to a clerk at Thomas Harding and Sons Foundry, selected 2 heavy pieces of 2-inch iron plate from foundry stock, and asked that the foundry bore holes through the iron and broadaxe, then bolt them together. When a foundryman asked what for, Moon explained that, "I'm inventing an instrument for making fruit baskets." He commandeered a Lar House porter named John Kane and another helper, led them to the wagon, and requested that they get the heavy trunk up to room 41. He cautioned them not to jostle the trunk because of the contents, for he was finishing work on an important invention to be patented. He followed the hard-breathing porters up to the room and there showed them precisely where and how to place the trunk. The porters left, and soon Moon locked the door and left again. Moon prowled the evening streets, seeing a few Civil War comrades and cheerfully enjoying the reminiscences of old friends. He returned to his room at 8 o'clock on Saturday evening, locked the door, and started his setup. The broad axe at one end was surmounted by 2 pieces of bar iron to give it weight. The beam to which it was attached was fastened to the floor by a hinge. The axe was held at an angle by a cotton cord which was tied to a hook in the wall. In close proximity to the cord, a candle was placed. It rested on a bracket made expressly for that purpose and screwed to the wall. With this much time, he strapped himself to the floor, head in the soapbox. He soaked the batting in chloroform, set the batting over his nose, and waited. In time, the candle burned the cord. The axe fell with a splattering thud. The suicide, however, took other measures to secure his death. He placed a box large enough to contain his head alongside where the axe would drop. Pointing down on the floor at right angles with the guillotine, he placed his head. He lay on his back. In order to avoid any displacement of his body by convulsions, he strapped himself to the floor. The straps, 2 in number, were screwed down. One was buckled tightly across the breast, under the arms, and the other over his leg at the knees. The box in which lay his head was securely screwed to the floor. Placing the cotton over his face, he put his hands under his suspenders and was no doubt soon unconscious. The axe fell and severed the head completely. Not a ligament joined it to the body. He does not appear to have moved a muscle or suffered the slightest pain. The face was not unpleasant to look upon. On Sunday afternoon, June 11, a Lar housemaid named Bridget Clogan tried several times to rouse the occupant of room 41 so that she could clean and straighten. By 5 p.m. Sunday, finding the room still locked, she entered the adjoining room 40 with a passkey, let herself into room 41, then screamed at the horror she beheld. A few doors down the hall, a startled traveling salesman from Cincinnati and a visiting Lafayette businessman, Henry C. Tinney, heard the screams and rushed to the maid's assistance. In room 41, the men saw Moon's body strapped to the wooden floor, his head cleanly severed by the blood-splattered broad axe bolted to a 6-foot-long wooden arm so as to constitute a crude guillotine. Lar house clerks sent for the authorities. Shortly, the Tippecanoe County coroner, Dr. William W. Vintage, arrived. For 2 days, Dr. Vintage studied Moon's suicide from every angle. Moon had already told few friends he was building a machine for making fruit basket. The evidence suggested that Moon had not invented a mechanism to make fruit baskets at all. It was at first supposed that a murder had been committed, but a little investigation demonstrated the fact that Moon had deliberately planned his own death and had determined that it should be brought about by an invention of his own. His kari-kari, as he termed the machine, was the result of years of study, but he was the only one that ever died by it. The inquiry set on foot developed these facts. On the Friday preceding the finding of his body, he was at home and was apparently cheerful. During the day, however, he had his beard shaved off, and from the barber shop he went to a hardware store and purchased 2 heavy bars of iron. The verdict of the jury was swift and simple: death by suicide, owing no doubt to mental instability. Rumors swiftly spread about Moon being brilliant but odd, a mechanical genius, a crazy man. Moon's surviving family and friends related how he had vowed someday to do something that will cause people to talk about me. That he did, but dozens of questions about the how and why, the when and the where, remain unanswered to this day. Moon was buried, Moon in a grave dug along the west side of the Farmers Institute Cemetery. Sarah Malcolm, the laundress who turned murderess. Sarah Malcolm, sometimes called Malcolm or Malcolm, was born in County Durham in 1710. Her parents were known as a respectable couple, and her father had an estate worth about £100 a year. However, he was an extravagant man, his money ran out, and the family moved to Dublin since her mother was Irish and could acquire accommodation and work there. Her father established a business in Ireland. According to The Ordinary, Sarah was given a good education at school and reading, writing, and such other things as are proper for a girl. When Sarah reached young womanhood, she accompanied her parents to London, where they had business to deal with. She went into domestic service in a series of good families where she gave satisfaction in carrying out her duties. Her father returned to Dublin where his main business lay, and shortly afterwards her mother died. Sarah fared less well on her own. She obtained employment serving in a low public house, the Black Horse in Boswell Court near Temple Bar. Then she became laundress to several residents who lodged in chambers above the Inns of Court in the Temple, amongst whom was a Mr. John Carroll, where she appears to have used a room, although she may have generally lived in Shoreditch. At this time, she made the acquaintance of Mrs. Mary Tracy and her friends, the young brothers James and Thomas Alexander. They often pressed her to cheat and steal from her employers since she had easy access to the places where they lived. Sarah Malcolm eventually agreed to assist them to rob a lodger in one of the temple chambers, a rich 80-year-old infirm woman, Mrs. Lydia Duncombe, for whom Sarah had worked in the past. Mrs. Duncombe shared her lodgings with a long-term companion, 60-year-old infirm Mrs. Harrison, and her young servant, 26-year-old Anne Price. The robbery was planned on 28 January 1733 and scheduled to take place the following week. On the 4th of February, late at night, Sarah managed to introduce the Alexanders into Mrs. Duncombe's lodging, where they hid until the residents were asleep. They then let Mary Tracy in, while Sarah remained on the stairs as lookout. She insisted she remain there until the other three came out with their booty, 300 pounds worth of currency, silverware, and other items. Then they went outside to share out their gains. The dead bodies of the three women were discovered the following afternoon. Anne Price's throat had been slit in a savage manner, and the older women had been strangled. When Sarah's master, Carol, found a silver tankard and bloodstained clothing in her room, he called the watch and she was taken into custody. Tracy and the Alexanders were also apprehended and held, but after Sarah's death they were released without charge. Sarah Malcolm was indicted for the murders and the robbery, but was tried for murder only at the Old Bailey on 23 February 1733. Her trial lasted 5 hours and was reported at length in a sensational manner. She defended herself strongly, admitting to participation in the robbery, a capital crime in itself, but emphatically denying the murders, of which she said she was unaware until they were later discovered, since she was only the lookout. Her defense was based on the fact that the blood on her clothing was her menstrual blood and not that of Anne Price. This may have done her more harm than good, as she spoke unashamedly of a taboo subject in the manner of a loose rather than a virtuous woman. The jury took only 15 minutes to find her guilty, and she was sentenced to death. Awaiting execution in Newgate, Sarah received the customary instruction in the Christian faith from the ordinary James Guthrie. In his account, he points out, with some distaste, that she was a Roman Catholic, and his instruction to her, soundly Anglican, underlines the view that her being of a different communion added to her guilt and unrepentant state. She received other visiting gentlemen who wished her to issue a confession that might make a sensational story to sell. She maintained her innocence of the murders to the end. She was particularly distressed that her execution was to take place in Fleet Street, near the Temple Gate, where her acquaintances and neighbors would witness it. 2 or 3 days before her death, she was visited by the painter William Hogarth, who sketched her and then painted her portrait. She was executed on Wednesday, 7th March 1733. On the evening of September 11, 1907, a part-time prostitute known by the name Phyllis Dimmick was murdered. Despite overwhelming evidence against her companion Robert Wood, no culprit was ever brought to justice in the ruthless slaying of the 23-year-old woman. Dimmick's story began in 1884 in the Hertfordshire village of Standon, where she was born as Emily Elizabeth Dimmick. Her family was poor and moved frequently. By the age of 17, Emily was working as a domestic servant in St. Neots. Later that same year, she went to live with her sister Maud, who found work for her as a servant in Finchley. From Finchley, Emily found her way to London, where she moved in a house owned by John William Crabtree. Crabtree was a small-time crook with prior convictions who was suspected of running a brothel. Likely, Emily was in her late teens when she began working as a prostitute near King's Cross, St. Pancras, and Euston stations. A few years after her arrival in London, however, Emily's life was markedly different. By 1906, just 1 year before her death, she was living in a common-law marriage with a young man named Bertram Bert Shaw. As Bert was only 19 at the time, 3 years Emily's junior, he would have required his parents' permission to marry, and so the young couple lived together without the official mark of marriage. Right before Emily's murder, they had received the blessing of Bert's parents to marry. Emily was, by most accounts, a dutiful partner. However, while Bert was away working as an overnight chef for the Midway Railway, Emily returned to her former, more sordid trade. Every day, Bert left their home at approximately 4:15 p.m., arriving back at around 11:30 the following morning. With Bert gone, Emily stepped out into the night. On September 11th, 1907, Emily, or Phyllis as she was known to her clients, was seen at Rising Sun, a public house in Euston Road, with a man named Robert Wood. Wood had met with her 5 days earlier, at which point he had written her a postcard that read, "Phyllis, darling, if it pleases you to meet me at 8:15 at the Rising Sun, yours to a cinder." It was signed Alice for discretion. The following morning, Bert's mother stopped by to pay Emily a visit, arriving before Bert was off his shift. When Emily didn't answer the door, the landlady allowed her to stay and wait for Bert to return. Upon his arrival, the three of them unlocked the door and came upon a gruesome sight. Emily's lifeless body. Her throat was slit wide open, and the sheets were covered in her blood. Bert's razors were in the wash basin, and someone had evidently washed his own bloody hands there as well. The room had been rummaged through, though nothing much had been taken, except for a few postcards. In the ensuing days, the handwritten postcard, postmarked on September 9th, and found by Bert as he was moving from the room he had shared with Emily, was identified as having been authored by Wood. One of Wood's girlfriends recognized his handwriting in the newspaper printed version of the card and notified the authorities. Robert Wood consequently was accused of the murder of Emily Dimmick. It was assumed that he accompanied her home, slept with her, and then killed her in the early morning while she was still sleeping. Cleaning himself, he then exited the room, locking up as he left. In conjunction with this story, witnesses watched a man of Wood's description, in particular gait. His right shoulder jerked as he walked, while his left hand was pushed deep in his pocket. Leave the neighborhood early on the morning of September 12th. John William Crabtree, Emily's former landlord, also proved to be a good witness, identifying Wood as a frequent guest of Emily's while she lived in Crabtree's building. During the trial, Wood's attorney, the famous litigator Edward Marshall Hall, gave a stunning performance. He helped paint a story of Wood's innocence, including a shaky alibi that had Wood at his ill father's house by midnight on the night of the murder. He also argued that Wood's walk was not, in fact, remarkable. Ultimately, the lawyer's skill led to his client's quick acquittal. The jury reached their verdict within 15 minutes. This happened despite the relatively strong evidence of his guilt. Though all evidence pointed to Wood, Emily's murder remains, technically, unsolved to this day.